Welcome to the Good Ideas Club, where big ideas spark even bigger conversations. What if your greatest weakness is actually your biggest strength on overdrive? Today, we're doing something we've never done before, exposing our own psychological profiles, live, unfiltered, and completely unscripted. Our guest is Strengthscope's master practitioner and positive psychology expert, Michelle Winn. And she's going to be telling us who we really are as founders and whether or not we're complementary. We also get into what the perfect team actually looks like, why most organizations are killing their own talent, and whether or not you can run an entire company by letting people just pick their own tasks every single morning. That and so much more.
Hey, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us on the Good Ideas Club. It's a pleasure to have you on here, particularly because you're a strategic partner of INSO's. I'm super excited for this episode, as is Alex, because we're doing something I think quite unique here. We are vulnerably, as founders, exposing our own strength profiles, having not heard or seen these profile results ourselves. We're doing it in the spirit of showing other people the power of doing things like this with an expert, and very, very excited to see how me and Alex fare or stand up to the test and stand up to your expert analysis. But welcome to the show. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, please?
Yep. So I'm Michelle Winn. I am a coach and facilitator based here in Guernsey, and I am also a Strengthscope master practitioner. So just to give you a quick rundown on what Strengthscope is. So Strengthscope's the tool that we're going to be using today to look at our strengths. I've also thrown my profile in there as well, just to sort of keep it all transparent. And what Strengthscope looks at is what we do that naturally energizes us, the things. So best way to describe it is that if you think about those flow states, when you're really kind of got that nice mix of challenge and you're really interested in something and you lose all sense of time, that's normally an indicator that you're utilizing your strengths. We all have different strengths and we all work in different ways. And so your profile is the actual numbers around it are that to have the exact same profile is about 1 in 1.3 billion. Wow. To have exactly the same amounts and exactly the same identical profile. So I quite like it because Strengthscope focuses more on how we are at work. There are other strengths profiling tools which I use as well in different situations. And so there's like VIA, there's Gallup Strengths Finder, and they all have really similar uses, and they all use a nice language that is really accessible. So rather than a lot of psychometrics, which kind of tell you, you're red, you're green, you're yellow, or various letters and different things that are quite unique to those psychometrics. Strengths profiling is more accessible language. It's the things that we would actually really refer to in everyday life. Like if we sort of say, somebody's really creative, we know exactly what that means. So it just gives us a shared language to look at.
And how does it compare? Because I'm glad you mentioned the letter ones and the kind of the different color hats and things like that. How does it compare to, say, a Myers-Briggs and the ones that the 4 letters with the what's the little ending bit on that? I can't remember, but I'm an ENTJ is what I know. But equally, I did that test years and years ago, so I don't know if I'm still an ENTJ. Does it change? But anyway, how does it compare to those sort of more traditional psychometrics?
Yeah, so I do use those as well in some ways, and they're really good for raising self-awareness of who you are, how you choose to work. Strengths is a layer on top of that almost, which is what energizes us, what we're quite good at, and what we've got the potential to be great at as well. So often as a general thing, we've got a negativity bias. So we tend to look at what our weaknesses are, what we're lacking. And the strengths profiling and strengths focus then just takes that to an alternative because it's a lot easier. So the Myers-Briggs and everything have got a place, and I use them a lot myself in different ways, but less and less so because I find that there's more and more research coming out that if you put people in boxes, it can be a little bit restrictive and it's a bit more collaborative.
It's an interesting kind of dichotomy.
on the personality side and psychological labeling and everything. Because on the one hand, it is good to identify strengths and weaknesses, but on the other, it's like, how adaptable are we really, and how susceptible are we to siloing ourselves into specific factions that have been given to us? Now, interestingly enough, Dan, the ENTJ one is known as the commander. And for context, Dan's background is 12 years military in the army. There's a nature versus nurture debate there, and I'd love to unpack what that actually looks like from your point of view.
Yeah. And the reason why I tend to now focus more on strengths is because rather than confining, it's more developmental, because we can access whatever we want, really. And in the right situations, we need to be able to access those. So our strengths and what we naturally migrate to and what we naturally use. But if we need to access other things, we can. They're quite developmental. And that's part of the reason why I quite like that strengths focus, because it's not restrictive. If we really, really need to intentionally work out a way of doing something and access a different strengths, it's within our capability. So there's a lot more individual, a lot more control over it, and a lot more movable.
I love it, because the reason why Peak Positive and INSO have formed a partnership, and Peak Positive is your organization, is because I think when we look at innovation and we look at getting stuff done, the people side of that is so important. Unless you've got kind of, everyone's talking about agents, AI agents that can just do their own tasks now, fine, that may be the way every bit of work gets done in the future. But right now, most things that get done need to have human beings incentivized and motivated to actually bother to do it. And so I look at this, and I saw the partnership with Peak Positive as a no-brainer, because if we're looking at, say, an innovation sprint or a process that is very outcomes and actions oriented, and typically as a team, it's like, as a team or as an organization, we need to be more innovative, or we need to drive this project. And that often ends at like 3 to 5 tangible actions that ideally we could go away and do tomorrow. The next part about that, and the natural follow-on to that is, okay, does it actually get done? And if so, who's going to own those tasks, and who's going to lead them, drive them, adapt to the change, adapt to when things inevitably weren't quite correct in the workshop, and actually in the real world through testing, we need to pivot slightly. That's all a very, very human thing. And so actually, the way I saw this working was, if we were to be able to identify really good actions for a team to take, if we were then able to supplement that task allocation to the right people within that team based on this strengths profiling, my theory is that statistically speaking, those actions are more likely to get done if we've given them to the right people. And again, within the tasks, some tasks might be bold and new and require someone who can cope with that level of newness. And some tasks just require someone to just actually do the hard work and the slog. And there may be a person who just loves doing that type of work, even though they may not be in the right job title or the right team that task might naturally be gravitating to or assigned to. That's the beauty of this. And that's why I'm very excited for our partnership. And that's why I wanted to do this show today. So just for context, Alex and I took the Strengthscope test, 2 days ago? We have very, very, very briefly seen the results. Like, we had a snippet of them before the show. We haven't gone into any level of detail at all. Hence why we're pretty much going to hand the reins over to Michelle as the expert to do what she does best. But we just wanted to do it with a microphone on and make it as authentic and as vulnerable and as raw as possible. And the reason we're doing this is because Alex and I want to double check that INSO is has good founders, and we're built on a good, firm foundation of leadership in the organization. And also, to your point earlier, Michelle, the military person in me does want to focus on the weaknesses or the areas to improve, or however we want to frame that, because I never want to rest on our laurels. And I always want to make sure that we understand our blind spots and we know how to be better, and we can work towards that. And if it's not something that we can do ourselves, how do we plug that gap? So over to you.
Yeah. And just to touch on sort of one of the points there that you made about wanting to focus on weaknesses through a strengths lens, because it's not, my background is in positive psychology, which a lot of people is not overly positive. It can be sort of seen as quite toxic positivity. That's not where I work. I'm from Yorkshire, so I'm quite down to earth and quite grounded, and also slightly cynical. And so that comes through in a lot of my work. And the great thing about Strengthscope is that it uses words like overuse because often we'll think of our weaknesses, but actually sometimes they can be strengths that when we're under pressure and we're under time restraints and things, we naturally lean into them too much. And then they become something completely different. So like you may well, in fact, actually to kick off, Dan, have got leading, which is possibly, again, going back to your military background. But that overused under certain situations can be steamrolling things, pushing people out of the way almost, and actually just going full steam ahead, which then becomes almost like a weakness. It's just overused. So it's that terminology which actually makes it a little bit less, a little bit easier and a little bit more less sort of condemning in a way. It's like, okay, I'm overusing that. Why am I overusing it? How do I dial that back?
It's a great way of framing it. Like, it's a really interesting way of framing it because it's so visual to see how, like, I mean, I see it as almost this like bar. We've got like, some sort of bar that says like where you're using it, almost like your sound, your audio level. Like when you're talking too loudly, it moves into the red. Like it's a positive when it's in that green zone and when it's moving in that direction. But again, like if you hit that red zone, it becomes overused, too loud, too whatever. I can see it. Like it's a really nice framing of it.
And equally, if we don't utilize our strengths and they're going to underuse, it's like that amber zone. It's like, well, we're not really actually accessing them and we're not fully utilizing all of our talents, which then can make people think that we don't have them because we're just not accessing them. And so it is exactly, it's that picture image of that dialing up, dialing down in order to get that optimal use for the situation. And going back to what you were saying about sort of working as teams to get that optimal use from everybody at the same time so that they're producing their best work in what that needs around it. And so anyway, going on to your profiles, so you've both just briefly had time to have a glance at them. So I'd be interested to find out what your initial thoughts were, what you felt was true, anything that jumped out.
Take the reins, Alex.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one because kind of guilty confession here. Dan and I briefly kind of talked before we were aware that it wasn't a good idea to talk. And we found out that our scores are very, very similar in terms of the 4 quadrants that is kind of measured. So for listeners at home, the quadrants are emotional, relational, execution, and thinking. So I'd love to dive in a little bit more as to what that actually means in terms of the relative disparity and how much you can actually expect to be different. Because my one, for example, was 28%, 25, 25, and 22, in which case I'm kind of a little bit unsure as to how that fits together, and to a larger extent, how does that look like when you take Dan into account, and how does that kind of founder puzzle piece relate to each other?
Yeah. So yeah, just to mention those 4 quadrants there. Those percentages that you referred to, they're done as a 25% baseline. And the nearer or further away you are from 25% is how much you either move away from that quadrant or you move into it. And then within each of those quadrants, there are individual strengths, and there are 24 strengths in total.
When I looked at my results, and I compared them against Alex, because, like, again, it was really interesting to see from my own perspective. But what I really wanted to see is, like, are Alex and I a clone of each other? I was kind of worried that we would be an exact clone of each other, because everything I think about when I talk about diversity to innovate, and all the advice I've ever had is, when you're building something, you don't want a bunch of people like you. You want as many different perspectives and as many different traits as possible. I talk about this all the time. It's a collective intelligence. It's a collective brain. It's a collective way of solving problems. Whatever that thing that you drop into that collective intelligence or that collective diverse pool is going to produce better outcomes if it's not all just the same personal mindset or way of thinking in that group. And so I was almost really worried that Alex and I would be too similar. And to Alex's point, I'd love to know, like, are we too similar from your perspective? Because there are differences. Like when you look at the top level strengths, we have some of the same. Like we both have creativity, we both have strategic mindset, we both like self-improvement. But other than that, we've got difference. Like Alex is decisive, emotional control, flexibility, persuasiveness. I have resilience, relationship building, leading, initiative. Is that a good balance, or is it close? Like, from your perspective, are we the same person or are we different?
So some of those things are things to be aware of, because because of those bits that are similar. So that creativity, self-improvement, strategic mindedness, there is that possible overdrive risk there that you accentuate each other. And so then it's maybe the question is then, how can you make sure that that doesn't happen together, and what you may need around it in order to prevent that, but also how those differences can be pulled together as well, and how they actually can then balance some of those things.
Because what if, let's say take creativity, top one on the list. Let's say I was creative, but Alex wasn't. Is there a risk then that within the thing we're creating together as like a business, that I own all the creative side and no one can challenge me because, let's say, Alex isn't creative? Is it not a strength actually that we're both creative, because then we've got two creative inputs coming together and in theory, the output of that, well, I guess then this is where you start to get into the other strengths, right? Because if there's two people who's creative and one's persuasive and one's submissive, or the equivalent, actually then it's more likely that the creative input of the persuasive one is the thing that's going to manifest. Is that true?
Well, I'll throw that back to you. How do you feel that works?
The fact that we're both creative.
You are both creative. What are the positives and what are the possible potential risks there?
I'll jump in on this
Alex,
one. So yeah, it's an interesting one, because you've also got to make the distinction here that it's largely self-perception, and that is something that is hugely relative on just whoever you look at, right? So there's is there even such a thing as objective creativity or not, which is kind of disputable. But yes, you do have the other traits that come into account when it's like, what does this equation look like? Because if both of us think that we're creative, then from the outset, that thinks that we're both entitled to have an opinion on something. Great. Now that goes down into how affirmative are you? How persuasive are you? Things like that. But there's also other aspects of this as to which how you actually apply your own characteristics. Because I, per se, could think I'm creative, but I also know that I will pick things that I'm assertive on. So if I think that Dan's idea might not be as great, or whoever's idea or whatever, like, there's other things to take into account. And I'd be like, you know what? It's not the end of the world. It's interesting. You could always be right. You could always be
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, interesting founder dynamic between us, because INSO from the outset is something that is all about knowing kind of where you are, where you could be, and making sure that you're asking the right questions, having the right perceptions, the right biases, fallacies, and really unpacking things. So in that sense, I think we are always neutral in our frameworks and our kind of when we're pitching ideas. So I think that Dan and I are very, very accepting of most, which gives a bit of a stalemate in a lot of things. But yeah, I think you have more experience on this, Michelle. So how do our profiles relate in terms of, is this kind of expected? Is this a pretty average discrepancy between profiles? Is it a lot? Is it not so much? What does that side of things look like?
I think it's interesting when there's only two people as well. And it's always interesting when you think about building out a team further and what that looks like. All of these profiles can then be utilized in terms of getting that diversity of thinking. That if you're really high in creativity, maybe you need somebody to just offset that.
Right.
But equally, it can produce really good stuff. Having both of you being really creative, if you design the way that you work so that you are both in that optimal green zone almost in creativity, when you need to come up with new ideas and you need to come up with stuff, you will be bouncing those off each other, which then generates more thinking. So it can be looked at that way. So if that's how you structure the way that you work, then you can get the best out of all of those strengths. And also it's that awareness then of other strengths that you can pull in to balance that if need be.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Alex said there. And what I love about Alex the most is one, his creativity. I mean, like we're in a creative business, like we're in innovation. We need to be creative always, but it's realistic creativity. It's, we're not just dreaming about what could be in 50, 100, 200 years time. Of course, that's part of the innovative thinking, but actually, there's a degree of practicality. How can we innovate tomorrow? When it's not always about reinventing the wheel. And so I love Alex because of his creativity and ability to span both ways of thinking. But I think there's an interesting part here in the sense that because we've both got self-improvement as a strength, it means that we can listen to each other and challenge each other in the guise that I know that actually I'm learning from Alex. When he challenged me, I don't take that personally because I know his heart's in the right place, and I know we're trying to build something that's incredible, and when we are building something that's incredible, and so I value his opinion, I value his creativity, I value his challenge of me because I feel that feeds into the self-improvement loop. Like I don't have all the answers, neither does Alex. I teach him things, he teaches me stuff. I challenge him, he challenges me. But I feel like the outcome then is always something that's better for it. I'd love to know if like one of us didn't have self-improvement in this top 7, would that then become a friction point? Maybe it's fortunate that we have self-improvement in there for this exact reason.
Yeah. That self-improvement then becomes that balance of keeping each other almost in check and checking, and that strategic mindedness that you share also having that common ground means that it obviously sounds like neither of you runs away with the other, that you're both kind of in step with that and can challenge and contribute equally on all of those things.
Yeah, I agree, and it's a really kind of awesome thing to be able to have to be just really open minded in a sense, because that means that you're never really too stubborn in the direction that you're going. You're always open to be learning from the other person, which that is the reality of things. But I'd like to kind of veer a little bit out towards how this functions in terms of larger organizations, because Dan and I run workshops all the time. And one of the things that we do in that is we explicitly try and break up groups to break silos and departments and teams and ways of thinking. Now, there's a really interesting dynamic, or rather a discussion that I'd like to have on this, because on the one hand, it would be hugely beneficial to make groups of people who are, let's say everyone's taken this test, right? Then you can strategically design it so that each group is diverse in its collection. But there's also the other angle of this in the sense that it's kind of a bit of a thinking fast and slow dynamic, because if you have a whole bunch of people that think they're creative, like, great, but maybe there's value in also putting people, let's say you've got a group that needs to be creative function, right? Could there be value in pairing a whole bunch of almost random people who aren't creative per se? Because that's like, now they're thinking in system 2. Now they're actively like, whoa, this is a new thing for me. And they bring different perspective, I think, in a sense, because if you put everyone that thinks they're decisive together, like it's going to be not an echo chamber, but no one's going to agree, for example. So what does that look like when you shake up the dynamic to that extent where it's almost like everything's upside down? Or should you rather optimize towards okay, great, these are the personality traits that are beneficial from like the team dynamic sense? Or
I love the visual. I like the vision there of putting like 10 decisive people in a group and watching the indecision as a result of that grouping, just seeing it like be this feedback loop of like, I want to be decisive, but I can't. I can imagine that group being entirely dysfunctional, but fantastic question, man.
Yeah, and also, so on the terms of an organizational level, what sometimes can happen is that what you've described as everybody who's really results focused gets drawn to a career path because that actually feeds what their strengths are. And that creates exactly that problem, because then you have a group of people who have all got results focus, for example, in which case, where's the creativity coming from? Where are those other dynamics coming from that are required to actually wholly do a full task almost and to achieve the bigger objectives? So that diversity of thinking, in order to bounce ideas off but challenge each other and fill different bits and the gaps that where some people fit, that as a whole, to me, is what makes a really good functioning team, is having that diversity of thinking, that diversity of talent and strengths, so that then those people together work towards that objective. and the outcome, as opposed to what tends to happen in most organizations at the moment is that we call them teams, but they're groups of individuals all working on different bits. That prevents us from actually getting the full outcome that would move things along. Does that make sense?
I gave a workshop the other day, and it was a Lego Serious Play workshop, and one of the slides in there covers this point exactly. You know, the difference between a group versus a team. A team can be bigger than the sum of its parts, but the co-facilitator I was working with, who's also an INSO ambassador, shout out to Leon, he also says that actually a member of that team or if members of that team also don't turn up on that day for whatever reason, could be personal issues, 2 plus 2 can equal 3 instead of 2 plus 2 always, again, maybe come back to your point about positive framing. The sum is bigger than its parts, but sometimes it's not always. And I think there's a very, very powerful thing to be had about the team psychology or a group psychology. How does a group of people view themselves? And the engineer in me loves the idea of running this test where maybe you've done this, where you do it for a big group of people. Have you seen clients or kind of leaders of these workshops who have commissioned getting this data go then and make decisions and changes in team balances because of the data? And have they given any feedback in terms of results that have come from that adjustment?
Yeah. So in particular, at board level almost, I've done some previous stuff where everybody then suddenly became very aware of what each other's strengths were. So that collaboration increased between. So rather than even within a team, externally, teams then became aware of what each was bringing to that, or what each individual at board level was bringing, or what each team was bringing, and how they could contribute. So then when you looked at, right, okay, what's the objective? What are you trying to achieve as an organization? And then at team level, what are you trying to achieve? Do we have all of the people with those skills to achieve that? And if not, where are we going to get them from? Where are we looking within our organization? Because obviously we talk a lot about talent gaps and skill gaps and things. I fundamentally believe that we're just not accessing the full talent that people have. They're either not engaging, they're not feeling like they're contributing. And often that's around the organizational structure and the conditions that are there, because those conditions either bring out the strengths in individuals and in teams collaboratively, or they can quash them and prevent them. So sometimes you hear leaders and organizations say, this person looked really good on paper, their CV was amazing, yet they're in post and they're not actually achieving anything. That's usually the conditions and the people around them that are preventing them from accessing all of their strengths fully and working in that optimal zone, as opposed to that being the wrong individual.
So I liked in the report where it says, to how to maximize your strengths. It also says about the vulnerabilities of overusing them, which I thought was very valuable and quite reflective. I'd like to drill into some of that on my own, from my own self, and if Alex is willing to as well. But almost like when I read it, it was almost like some sort of like managerial HR ticks in the boxes. Like, have you had the opportunities to scratch your creative strengths? Like, I almost had this vision of some sort of corporate HR manager kind of sitting down with their team, and almost that appraisal process, having these 7 listed strengths and saying, this quarter or this whatever time period, have you felt that this, and maybe this sounds quite robotic and horrible, but have you felt like you've had your creative talents maximized or developed this quarter? Like, yes or no? Okay, well, what can we do to solve that? As opposed to kind of general objectives like get X number more sales or do this or do that. Do people do that? Like, do people tailor appraisal processes based off these strengths and kind of say, like, have you had this strength of yours fulfilled from again, subjective, right? It's, to Alex's point, like, it's how I feel about it. Like, if for example, I was to sit down with an HR leader who said, we know you're resilient because it said this in the profile. Do you feel like you've been able to demonstrate that in the last quarter in your job? And if the answer is no, then what are they? Then that's on them to do something about that, right? Does anybody ever do it like that systematically for each individual?
I think those conversations should be led by the other person. So those conversations should be, how are we providing? How are you showing up at the moment? Do you feel like you are doing your best work? Do you feel like you're engaged in what you're doing? And if not, what is it that's missing? And sometimes that will then, if an individual has their strengths profile and knows what things they do that energizes them, that engages them, then they can create what they need, and then HR and organizations can start to help them to build that.
So I'd like to just dive into that a little bit more, because the reality of this is, in theory, this is amazing. But when you look at an organization that's already operating, that's kind of really on a workflow basis, because that is what orgs and teams do. They optimize towards workflows and things that need to be done. If you then retroactively go and find out what the strengths and weaknesses of the teams are, can you best, let's say you're an organization of 500 people, how can you best optimize that process to play to all the strengths and weaknesses within the kind of reality of things? Like, how do you train so many different skills? How do you make sure that everyone feels heard and voiced and everything like that, whilst also knowing that they are bound to the work that they do? Like, you can't just go and now reorganize every single team and marketing department. And there's also silos, right? Like, the marketing department is naturally going to be creative. So how do you kind of puzzle piece this together in an ideal reality?
And that's, I think, where organizations really do struggle. And organizations are traditionally structured, usually. And as you say, there is a workflow, there are things that need to get done. But you can then, so the question that I would be asking, and the question that I ask a load of my clients is, right, okay, so this is what outcome you need. You need to produce this. How can you best utilize the strengths that you have to produce the outcome? If that makes sense, because you can utilize the strengths for a specific outcome. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to change everything and you have to change what it is that you're trying to achieve. You can just adjust the way that you approach it. Does that make sense? So if I use an example, so my strengths are sort of creativity, developing others. One of the things that I really, really struggle with is marketing. I am not great at marketing. And so I need, as a business, I need to do marketing. That's like an essential task. That's something that I have to do. Otherwise, I am not going to have a business. So the way that I work with my coach is, this is not something that is a natural strength of mine. Persuasiveness, all of those things that are really, really useful in marketing and selling are not strengths of mine. How can I use my strengths to get the same outcome? So I do, mostly my marketing is through giving workshops, talks, things like that, so that people get to know me and I can add value and I can develop people. So that's developing others, that I can utilize that to achieve that outcome. Does that sound like it makes sense? So it's a task that I have to do. The way that I approach it can be very individual to me. Often organizations are not flexible on the way that things are done, where they've got structured ways of doing things, which sometimes they can be relooked at quite easily.
Is it that, because again, like coming back to my profile. So yes, my 7 were creativity. My 7 strengths were creativity, initiative, leading, relationship building, resilience, self-improvement, and strategic mindset. And I don't disagree with any of those. And I look at my areas that were lowest on the scoring, and I kind of know it: empathy, compassion, common sense, which was interesting, because I feel like I've got common sense, but apparently I don't. But yeah, empathy and compassion was the thing that I was like, I know this thing's going to bring that out with me, because my wife will tell you I struggle with emotions. And then it gets me thinking, like is this process about leaning into what is just naturally good for me? So those strengths I listed, like, should I just be leaning into those and accepting that actually I'm not very empathetic or compassionate? Or should I view it as like, actually, I would be more rounded if I could get those scores up?
I think it's about having an awareness so that you can lean into what you need to for the situation, because not every situation is going to require empathy, but there may be situations where you really, really do need empathy, in which case then you can intentionally look at how you develop that or where you get that from. So it's almost like you can then utilize your other strengths to increase that. So you've got self-improvement in there. So how could you use your self-improvement to increase your empathy? So it's kind of looking at things from a number of different perspectives, and knowing what you bring as your best self, and fully to that, and how how you can then utilize what you need to get the best outcome.
Alex, what were your lowest scoring 2 or 3, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, so mine was on the, let's see, lowest on thinking, and then everything else is kind of balanced. So lowest thinking, highest emotional, which, yeah, I mean,
And then
I
also,
don't know
Alex,
what.
so
Yeah, go for it, Michelle.
so you scored low, yeah. So I'm just having a glance there, and so detail orientation was not one of your significant 7 strengths. Efficiency, results focus were kind of 3 of the ones that were not your significant strengths.
Yeah, Dan
Would you
will be able
agree?
to tell you that I am not very detail orientated. Like, there are so many times where there's typos and minor things, and I'll go 90% of the way on any task, but I get bored very easily. So that's one of the things that I know are one of my weaknesses that I am working on. Yeah, and again, there's other things too where there's kind of, let's say, creativity, for example. Like, I scored highly on that, but I'd also say that Dan is way more creative when it comes to just cool random ideas. So I wonder how do you encapsulate creativity in that sense, right? Like, I think we're both very open-minded, and I don't know if that's maybe the metric that is measuring, but it's very kind of abstracted in a lot of these terms, which is also one thing to note, right? Because you can't just say, oh, he's flexible, he's not flexible. Like, in what context? Like, so many different things, environments, situations, which I think is also something worth noting.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things with strengths and looking at strengths is that it has built, you can intentionally move it around. So, and it means different things to different people. So like you say, what creativity means to you is maybe different, but actually as a scientific base, it's coming out as a similar thing from the questionnaire. And so that's where, like you say, different circumstances, different things mean that you might need to lean into one thing, you might need to develop another, but those are all within your control. Whereas sometimes we put ourselves into those boxes and we just decide that we're going to stay there. So it's the intentionality, I think, which actually is what you're kind of indicating there, Alex.
And I think Alex and I are in a weird position because we think about this stuff probably a lot more frequently and a lot more deeply than the average person, because it's part of our job of understanding innovation and the psychology behind it. But like, I like the questionnaire of the Strengthscope because it asks questions from a different framing. Like, to Alex's point, it's very easy to say, like, he might be the most creative person in the world, but at that given moment when he answers that question, he may be not feeling particularly creative. And so in comparison to his standard of creativity, he is not creative in that moment. So I get that. But I think the question is quite well designed because it says, it asks questions with the starting, like, people often say that I'm creative, which if you answer that, the true version of that question, it's not, again, your definition or their definition of creativity doesn't matter. Have people told you that you're creative or some variant of creative? And if the answer is that, people are telling me every day, well, the answer is like strong yes, irrespective of how you feel. So I like to think, and when I read the questions and when I answered it, I tried to take very that first part, like, I think I am versus other people tell me that I am, and then ending of the question. I tried to really consider that and answer that as honestly as possible, which I think, Alex, maybe negates some of that self kind of
Yeah.
analysis of the definition of the word.
So I'd like to kind of jump in on that a bit more, because there's a lot in life that you kind of hear based on what your own perception is and based on what you like to hear, right? So it goes back to Therese's RAF framework. So response, action, feelings, and thoughts. So what does that actually look like? Because, for example, if I aspire to be creative, then if someone's like, yeah, that was a really cool marketing post that you did, I'm going to remember that. Whereas someone else might just like discard it as, oh, cool, thanks. But also there's interpersonal dynamics there at play, because if you're not a very approachable person or not a very sociable person or whatever, there's a lot of noise that comes into the equation on that. So I wonder if there's a way almost to have a couple tests. So one is the perception of self, which again, there's lots of issues with that, which is not specifically Strengthscope. It's just kind of self-perception is very biased and this way to objectively measure someone. someone. Then you've got the other side of things where it's like, maybe you should get someone else. So within the context of teams, get someone else or the rest of the team to review that person and then do an analysis of the delta between the self-perception or the aspirational side of you and your reality, how you operate within that team and those dynamics. I think there'd be a lot of interesting data that would come out of something like that.
100%. That must have been done, right? Surely you can flip Strengthscope for other people.
Well, Strengthscope does have a 360. So what it does is you can actually nominate raters. So you can give a list of raters within Strengthscope platform, and they will get asked what strengths do you see? How much do you see them using this strength? And what do you notice? So that then it provides that layer of self-report and other raters and what others are seeing.
Yeah, and I'd suggest you need like at least a 3-to-1 ratio there. If 3 people independently are saying something similar about you, then that is, to me, a pattern, right? That's one person could just be someone who doesn't like you, and that's going to be skewed. 3 is a data point. More than that starts to increase that data point's validity and accuracy. But I'd love to do that and then challenge that against, like Alex said, the delta of self-perception. That would be a fascinating exercise to do. So maybe we do that as a follow-on episode when we got a few more people. Coming back slightly to the team then and INSO, if we were hiring for someone right now, Michelle, what do you think the target persona we should be looking at to fill to plug those gaps that Alex and I have?
So if you look at some of those 4 sections as a whole, you would ideally be looking at somebody that is strong in those so that it balances things, so that you have that more diverse thinking and diversity of strengths. So coming back to what I was looking at as well, which is why I shared my profile with you, because we were talking about our strategic partnership. And when you look at my profile next to it, when I'm thinking about how can I add value, how can I as Peak Positive add value to INSO, I'm strong in empathy and I'm strong in emotion and enthusiasm, emotional control, and those bits which I then know that those bits, having looked at your profiles, are bits that are probably not going to be the most natural for you guys. So I can see where I can possibly add value and where I need to maybe focus.
So we've already found the perfect trio, right? This is this is awesome. Incredible. It's an often cited kind of ism that happens when a group of humans spend too long with each other, that they all eventually tend towards the same person, which is, again, to my earlier point, why I think it's so important to keep that collective intelligence and that diversity within a group, that dynamic and fluid. Has there been any, I don't know, data or things done by things like Strengthscope that actually can confirm that? Because again, if you were to take, let's say, a brand new team that was forming, I did a big workshop recently for a global innovation team that was forming it was incredible. The company that was putting this together was so exciting, so inspiring, doing all the right things. And that they would be the perfect kind of target for something like this. Do Strengthscope on day one of the team being there. So they haven't yet been kind of tainted by each other's perceptions and humanisms and the way they work and the way they think and all those other things that start to, determine how a team functions over time. I'd love to then compare that same team on, especially with a team that had something as inspirational as you need to be more innovative or make the company more innovative. It's a very positive kind of framing of the problem they need to solve. Within 2 years' time, I'd love to do something like a Strengthscope to see how, if that theory was true, you'd think that diverse set of profiles from around the world would start, in theory, to converge and become similar. Are you aware of anything like that's data driven and proves that concept?
So Gallup do vast amounts of research on all of this stuff, on strengths and things as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to sort of take that and whether they do converge. But in theory, they should stay fairly stable, because each will almost counteract the other, if that makes sense. So it levels it. So rather than everybody going off in one direction, everybody's going in the same direction, but from slightly different perspectives, which is where you get that diversity. And that's partly why I sort of do a lot of work around strengths, because when people think of diverse teams, they think of diversity of background, diversity of gender and things like that, whereas actually strengths puts a whole other layer on top of that as well, which is where's the diversity of strengths and are we utilizing those?
Well, this is well timed because I'm giving a TED talk in a week, and I actually talk about collective intelligence, and I list a kind of few features that I want to see in like diversity of any variable that shapes how a person sees the world, and I'm going to make sure that very specifically the word strength is included in that list because I think it's a really powerful thing to include and think of when you think of also the word diversity.
Another huge thing that we haven't really touched on yet is the importance of just interpersonal dynamics as a whole, because you could have the perfect team structure in theory, but someone could not like someone or be slightly too persuasive or have different incentives and directions and just general misalignment, busyness, urgency, just everything that gets thrown at you on the daily. So how do you balance those? Because surely the silver bullet is not as simple as just making the best Strengthscope team.
No, but it does give a language that actually is shared. And it also takes away a little bit of that personal attack almost. So the way that I've seen it really well used in teams is if somebody is perhaps kind of not is if say they've got a real strength of decisiveness and they're just making decisions and they're not including people, that then means that other people that know that and that have that awareness can actually approach that with, is everything okay? Because we're seeing this. So are you under pressure? Are you stressed? What's happening? Because actually, if somebody is in those sort of where those conflicts happen are usually when somebody is either underusing that strength or overusing it. Often it's overuse because that creates a whole sort of thing that people then go, actually, we don't like that. But that happens because that person is often under pressure. And so it actually takes away that personal attack, that personal conflict, and gives them a shared language of being able to check in on each other and just go, well, actually, I'm seeing this. And normally you're like, usually you look, this is how you are. What's going on? Why are we seeing that difference? And what do we need to do? And what would you like us to help? Is there any way that we can help with that? And so that changes that whole conversation from conflict to actually compassion.
Alex, did you have your other
Awesome.
questions you want to?
Yeah. Okay, I'll jump in on them now. So really exciting, actually. Michelle, so Strengthscope is fantastic. And I mean, there's just so many different metrics and tools that we're kind of in a smoothie of in this day and age, right? You've got theories of personality, you've got kind of Belbin's team roles and 100 others, you've got Strengthscopes, you've got theories of the different intelligences and kind of how that plays. You've got environments, you've got situations, you've got so many different factors. So if you could build the perfect organization, how would you stack those different aspects together? How do those piece together to make things most functional? And how does Strengthscope fit within all of that?
So I think all of these things are quite useful in terms of raising sort of our self-awareness and awareness of others and how other people work, because often as it, again, it's that, are we a group of individuals or are we a team? And as groups of individuals, we are, as humans, we see the world from our perspective. So anything that feeds into that and gives us different perspectives and challenges that slightly and makes us think, actually, is that accurate? Is that the way that actually is? Gets us to look at the evidence a little bit more. I see as only being positive. So all of those things that come in, I think we need to look at the validity of a lot of things. And so part of the reason I use Strengthscope is because it's registered with the British Psychological Society. So it's been through quite a lot of testing processes. There are a lot of things that are not quite so validated. So you've got to look at those aspects as well as to how tightly you hold that information. And then the way that I kind of, so organizations, as I see them, have kind of put this reliance on these leaders at the top. And there's a lot of emphasis on those leaders and on their skills and on their strengths, how they interact with everybody else. And I used to do quite a lot of leadership development work and slightly moved away from it because I felt that it was a lot of responsibility to put on a couple of people. It's like, oh, that person's carrying all of that. Is that fair? And maybe organizations, rather than looking from the top down, perhaps we need to just flip that and start looking from the bottom up, because that would fit together and give people at each level a little bit more of what they possibly need to produce their best work. Because I don't think that anybody goes to work wanting to produce bad work. But I think that sometimes the way that organizations are structured and the conditions that they build around that prevents it and prevents them from doing their best work.
Alex, who was it that we had on the show that was telling us about the model where they could volunteer for leadership positions, but they were not obliged to stick with it if it didn't resonate with them? And there's something about that which chimes nicely with this, in the sense that if organizations, and again, not just about leadership, if an organization could create some sort of mechanism where you could test, I'm just picking a random one off the list, where you could test your courage and expose that and stretch that a little bit more, but in a way that wasn't committing to, say, taking on a managerial position. And this company nailed it, because you didn't get a pay rise. You didn't get, again, there was no expectation. It wasn't kind of something that you were judged on if it went badly, but it was something you could dip your toe into. And if you liked it, then that could be a path that you started to walk down properly. Who was that, Alex? That
It might have
resonates
been
here with me.
Leon, Dan.
Could have been, but it was a nice thing here, like, to build, and again, to Michelle's bottom up approach. I feel like that's a nice way of saying leadership isn't something that's earned through maturity, performance, time, which again tends to kind of narrow as that hierarchy. You can only have one, or some places have two, multiple CEOs, but that those leadership positions kind of narrow pretty quickly. And so to even get a sniff at them means that you have to be at that level. I loved something about this, and I don't know, I don't know how you could build that in, to your point, Alex, earlier, where you can't just flip the whole model. You can't just give everyone the perfect job they love doing, because there is, unfortunately, the stuff that just no one really enjoys doing. It's just the part of work that you don't like. We had a whole separate conversation on what that balance is. I can't remember what it was. Was it something like you deal with 70% of stuff that you didn't like if you were at least given 30% of things that did get you ticking or get you kind of excited? So I wonder how that fits into this as well. No, I think it's fantastic. Bringing it back to my point earlier about what I look at this for, I'm like, let's say we have tasks. Let's say we need to do something to get a project moving, or to initiate a project, or even to wind down a project and call a spade and kind of just accept that it's done. And giving those tasks to the right sort of people. I think my hypothesis would be that actually, if we were to assign those tasks based on your individual strengths and your ability to deal with that, my perception would be that we'd see much higher success rates of those things getting executed, which is one of the biggest problems I see with just like organizations not being able to innovate properly. It's a lack of actually ability to execute mainly. And I think that's largely driven by human isms.
It's an interesting one. So just thinking out loud here, and probably completely wrong on this, but the angle that I would take is I distribute tasks with, there'd be a partial kind of predisposition. So let's say someone's good at deciding, great, like some of that I'll give to them, but I'll also explicitly give them things that they're bad at so that they can become more well-rounded in a sense. Because I'm wondering what the future of work looks like, really. If you fast forward this 10, 15, 20 years or whatever, what are the best teams? Are they ones that are truly dynamic and well-rounded, that can be supplemented with AI and agents, things like that are really good from an interpersonal point of view? Are they ones that are really good in silos? Because there's always that debate too of, do you go the generalist route or the specialist route? So I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of how you develop those things. And do you just go maybe even just completely the interpersonal side? Because if you're good at dealing with people, it doesn't matter how you guys fit together. It's just you guys will naturally kind of disperse that amongst yourself.
I think that there's also one of the things that I'm really interested in and fascinated by is that whole, what would happen if everybody was very clear on what the objectives were? Because that clarity and that contribution, that what we're actually all supposed to be working for is really essential to give us all, to let us know where we fit into the bigger picture, which creates meaning and purpose, which are two of the things that people need to do their best work as well. And what happens if we sort of stop holding these job descriptions quite so tightly and have conversations about, right, this is what the outcomes need to be. These are the things that definitely need to get done. How do we best do that? And who's contributing what? And do we need to kind of look at the way that those are done to get the same outcome, but in a slightly different process? And there's like a lot of work being done around job crafting, which is where you kind of amend your actual job description so that it gives you more to engage with. It gives you more purpose and meaning within that role, so that then you are actually bringing all of your strengths, you are doing your best work, and you're more engaged. And there's a lot of research that's being done on that at the moment as to, does that create far better outcomes than the traditional command and control approach? A lot of organizations want, they say, like, I hear a lot, like, nobody wants to be accountable. But if we're treating people that we're just telling them what to do, it's really difficult for them to be accountable for that, because they're just following orders.
Yeah.
So if you want accountability, give people autonomy, and then they'll have to take, then they naturally will take, they're accountable for that, because they have decided exactly what their contribution is going to be, and then they follow that through.
But that comes back to the organizational and the leadership's tolerance of risk, because this structure gives this false sense of control and ability to mitigate risk. Like, I've got this person trained in this job. I know they're going to do it reliably. I can accept the tolerance that they may turn up to work with not at their A game every now and again, and that's fine. And if that happens too often, then you can get sacked or replaced or whatever. But like what you just described there, that fluid model, you lose that kind of, it feels like you've lost control of that structure. And actually, if that were to implode and go wrong, then everyone's accountable. But so what? The business has failed. It's kind of like, it seems like scary to take that leap. Yeah, it's coming from the military. Like, one of the reasons I left is because I honestly felt like my creative side wasn't given a second of airtime because of the structure and the hierarchy. And the military loses, I think, a lot of great people because of the rigidity of the structure. And I think they're dabbling with and experimenting with a few kind of like internship package, like go and work for a civilian agency somewhere, or go and see if the grass is greener on the other side. But again, know that you can come back. Kind of to that point earlier about go and test leadership or test something else, but know that you've got the safety net of coming back. I don't know. I don't know. Like, will humans really ever let go of that structure and that hierarchy?
Here's the thing,
it something that we can do? Is it something that, as you...
Sorry, Dan. So I think the answer to that question is essentially, is it economically valuable to run that structure? That's I think the crude and reality response of how organizational structures really diffuse out. Now, it would be really interesting to see what a model looks like if there was kind of complete fluidity from a team level. So let's say you've got a organization of 1,000 people. What would it look like if you had 10 or 20 teams within that organization? So you have a central kind of leadership body, but then apart from that, you've got, okay, great. You've got your annual AGM. This is what we want to do. This is how we think we're going to get there. Everyone kind of arrange yourself in the way in which you think is most exciting and what you're passionate about. Great. You've got your 10 to 20 teams. Wherein you then decide what that structure looks like amongst yourself, if there even is any structure. But you basically have a whole bunch of founders where, let's say you have a base salary of X amount a year, and you get then paid based off your performance, because that is ultimate agency. In a sense, you are making your own little organization. You're accountable as agreed upon by yourself and others for the specific sections. I don't know if that would just fall apart, because I'm sure you can only have so many cooks in the kitchen before it gets crazy, but it would be an interesting one to explore.
I have a vision of this like giant kind of warehouse. So everyone turns up to work in this giant warehouse where there's a bunch of like sub offices around the side. There's a big screen up on the wall where it says like today's tasks that need to be done. And like people are like, yeah, I'll take task 3. And there's like, yeah, task 3 on me. And then they go take a room and they just go and solve that. And like every day you go in, like you just pick a task that resonates with you that day, but you don't know who else is going to resonate with on that day. And you find yourself like, again, like that middle kind of the bull bit just goes out and everyone works in their own kind of like WeWork style breakout rooms. And if there's an issue, it gets put up on the big screen. And again, people just come in and switch out. Like, I don't know, like that would be awesome to test.
Yeah, that could go horribly wrong, I guess. It's exciting and frightening all in one go.
Alex, I want to take it on. Like, we need to make a workshop out of that. We need a big enough.
Absolutely. So what would this look like, Michelle, in your view? If you had a organization where, let's say, fine, you've got the structural constraints of just business as usual, but if you allowed people to switch 3 times a year within the organization, if it's big enough, that if they don't like their specific team or thing that they're doing, they can freshen things up, because that goes back to the kind of entrepreneur side of things, the diversity of thoughts of things. Because if you can go from the marketing function and now switch on over to finance, you have a unique perspective on things. Like you might be a little bit more creative or whatever that might be, but you also have different situational contexts that you can then apply to that team.
Yeah. And I think that that's really, and I think there are some organizations that kind of do that in their graduate schemes and things where they go and they place themselves as like they're in different teams for sort of 6 months at a time. And I think that adds quite a lot of value. Also, as well, sort of that up and down mentoring as well also gives a little bit of that and gives a different perspective. And I think that in terms of organizations, when you speak to people in different teams, they have no idea what those other teams do and what they're all contributing towards. And I think that that clarity of this is what we do, this is what we do, but let's mix it up is actually really, that would be really, really good, I think, because then people would get that shared understanding of when I'm asking you to do this, I kind of know what that is. Whereas sometimes people are asking people to do things and they don't know what the constraints are within that team. And that causes quite a lot of friction between teams and creates these further silos. So something like that, I think, could be absolutely great. Like, yeah, you want to go and test out another sort of area, learn some new skills, see how your strengths apply under that without actually having to go to a complete other organization, I think would be really, and I think organizations would probably benefit quite well from that.
Yeah, I think so too. I think so too. I think that giving people kind of choice, agency, and ultimately, if it doesn't go well, then they own that decision, right? They either made the decision to do it in the first place. If they enjoyed it, they made the decision to follow that, or if they didn't enjoy it, then they come back. If they made the decision, the fact that they enjoyed it, but they were actually too scared to take the leap, well, that's on them. They haven't been pushed there. I think the ownership of these opportunities is a really important piece. The one last point I wanted to just let you talk about, Michelle, was your aspiration to map the entirety of Guernsey. It seems to be like a world leading giant Strengthscope style project. Tell us a little bit more about that and why you're doing it.
Yeah. So yeah, because I sort of I naturally work in questions, which is why I'm a coach. Literally, I'm like, how does that work? What does that do? What would happen if that happened? What would that look like? And so one of those random thoughts that I had was, what would happen if we knew what everybody's strengths were as an entire population, and what would that mean to an island? Because actually, it's one of the few places that are so boundaried because there's sea around it. So actually it creates a natural boundary that a lot of other places don't have access to, which also creates opportunity. And within that, it's like, well, what would it look like if we all actually had that awareness and we had that language around, well, actually, this is what I do because this is what I really enjoy. This is what really engages me. So this is where I can fit. This is where I can contribute best and where I best fit. And again, it's like almost treating an entire population like a large organization in some ways. What's everybody bringing, and are we getting the best from people? Are we providing the conditions that people need for them to do their best work and to produce and to contribute the best to society? Because I think sometimes structures within society restrain as opposed to develop people. So yeah, so I am looking at how that works and putting together a whole research program around that, which is looking like it might be more accessible than what I originally thought, and is actually getting some people to come in and help with that. So I am speaking to VIA and about their strengths profiling tool because it's quite accessible. It doesn't just apply to work situations. Strengthscope is really, really good at looking what your strengths are in relation to a work scenario. And VIA is a little bit more holistic, a little bit more what character strengths do you have as a whole and in all situations. So we're looking at possibly trying to do that soon.
Yeah, watch this space. We're cooking up a few ideas with a much bigger group, right? So no spoilers on this one. But hey, thank you so much. As we start to wrap up, I just wanted to, coming back to our individual profiles. But this episode was all really about like exposing a bit of vulnerability, learning a bit about ourselves, and doing that in hopefully a way that people can see the value of knowing the information from an individual point of view, but also how that extrapolates out to groups and organizations. I think we've covered everything really nicely. Two questions I want to ask both of you. What strength out of your top 7 are you most proud of, and why? Does anyone want to go?
Take that.
Yeah, I'll go first. That's a hard one. So I'd probably caveat by saying it's very close between flexibility and self-improvement. But I think that the winner on that is going to be flexibility, because I feel like the world is so rapidly changing. Your perception thereof is also changing. You're learning. So if you're able to stay flexible and by extension open-minded on things, I think that's a huge, huge benefit. And I think that it also allows you to move a lot faster. So yeah, that's the one I'm kind of happiest about. It's quite low on the thing, but nonetheless, I am very much proud of that, and is something that I'm trying to work on. So yeah, Michelle, what about you?
Yeah, I think the empathy. I think that however, I'd caveat that with the fact that I've got high emotional control as well. So it doesn't that kind of those two work together in terms of I can really sort of see where somebody's coming from and have a lot of empathy with their situation, but I've got the emotional control not to get pulled into it too much. So I can remain objective, which for my work is of real importance, that I don't get pulled in any which way.
Yeah. So yeah, yeah, I can see why that's important. My one's relationship building, because I love connecting the dots between people and seeing people building relationships for myself again. But I love making other people get connected, and the opportunities that inspire and kind of emerge and ripple from an introduction that I've made is, I am most proud of that when I'm able to achieve that. And then the obvious follow-up question, sorry, I mean, you're not off the hook yet, is what strength on that list is something that you wish you had more of, and why?
Mine would be, sorry, Dan, I've obviously missed this then, because mine is persuasiveness, but you said I've already got it on the list, which I don't really believe I do.
Yeah,
It's,
I got
it's something that could be way higher.
That's on your top 7, man.
You like it?
Let me check. Michelle,
It's
you've
on
got him up there, right? Is
persuasiveness
persuasiveness on
already.
his top 7?
Yeah, you're quite high in persuasiveness
Yeah,
already.
you got to pick another one. It's got to be a blue one. He nearly persuaded us that it wasn't on the list, right? That's his skill.
Okay, my lowest one by far is definitely detail orientation, which I think it would be good to be able to just follow tasks through more systematically. But it's a kind of blessing and a curse, because I maintain my sanity by task switching and kind of moving on to the next thing.
Michelle?
Yeah, the one that results focus. I would love to actually keep a closer eye on the results of things and get there possibly, as opposed to getting distracted by my creativity and going off down rabbit holes.
Uh, I can, I can empathize with that, but it's yeah. My one would be compassion, because I feel like sometimes the army in me comes out, like it just go go go, like too abrupt, too just get moving. And sometimes I want to have more compassion and understand people, which kind of links to the empathy piece as well. So yeah, something I do want to work on as part of my self-improvement strength. So Michelle, in true Good Ideas Club fashion, we will close on a question, which you get your chance to get your own back for the next guest. But your question is, what is your definition of innovation?
Doing things differently. So innovation, because I was thinking about this just the other day actually. Because obviously it's been bandied around quite a lot. It's a word that is used and tends to sort of link to technology quite a lot. Whereas actually I think innovation is just looking at the way that we do things and coming up with different, better solutions in whatever that may be, whether that's actually how we achieve that task, whether it's just the way we function as humans and what that looks like. All of that to me is innovation.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Well, it's been an absolute whirlwind of a conversation. I mean, there's so much more to unpack. And I mean, I'm with Alex. I'd love to see more of this data. I'd love to experiment with Strengthscope's 360 tool, because I think validating your own perception of how you've answered this, combined with how you're perceived by others, I think will give you a really, really fascinating honest view of yourself, and particularly paying attention to the delta and the gap that might exist between the two. But very much looking forward to working with you and Peak Positive, because I think, yeah, to your point about innovation, it's definitely much bigger than technology. I'm very passionate about that. And I think the people strand is often neglected. And I think the work, what you're doing there, helps to really plug that gap, but make it data driven, and so that we can all innovate better. Thank you so much. Great to have you on.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.